Thank you, Karen Kohler, for inviting me to participate in this event and to this wonderful library, which is clearly one of the great gems of Damariscotta. And I finally want to acknowledge George Mason, who 53 years ago invited me to visit Damariscotta, and the magnetic gravitational pull of his friendship has brought me back time and time again until we finally set anchor in New Harbor. So George, thanks. Well, I was once asked what it means when a Presbyterian minister carefully pulls out his pocket watch and places it on the podium directly in his line of vision. The answer, absolutely nothing. Brevity is an endangered virtue in my denominational tribe, and the challenge of time management is especially overwhelming when the issue at hand is religious conflict and its origins. There are so many theories in circulation, so many experts pontificating on the problem, and from so many different points of view: psychological, theological, anthropological, sociological, philosophical, political, economic, and historical accountings. Even the literary theorists, neuroscientists, and talk show hosts have produced multiple expositions. Today I'm going to root my own musings in some personal experiences, as you'll see. You see, since my college days, I've been haunted by the question: how is it that the great religions proclaim messages of hope and love, but the adherents of these same traditions all too often get seduced by ideological agendas, deploying religion as an instrument of hate and violence? Not just the zealots, not just the fanatics are involved in these hostile takeovers. All manner of believers become active participants or apathetic bystanders in bigoted, even murderous schemes, calling into question the spiritual and ethical credibility of the world's major religions. This is the hard and unsettling truth. And it is a challenge that has preoccupied me over the years. In my case, the problem goes to my core. Has Christianity, the tradition in which I am rooted, the tradition that shaped my sense of beauty and nobility, the tradition that is my home, this Christianity, the one in the marrow of my bones, is it morally bankrupt, capable of savage extravagance and lethal complacency? For 33 years, I served as the executive director of the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. Originally, for the first 20 years, it was the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies, and then we expanded the scope of our mission to include Islam. Well, I've been afforded the opportunity to wrestle with these questions in the company of ministers, priests, rabbis, and imams, scholars, and community leaders, seminary students, and all kinds of ordinary folks who simply want to learn how the world looks when seen through the lens of a different religious community. Together, we have struggled to confront the problem, and we have struggled to neutralize the combustible ingredients. When I first began at the ICJS, I can remember efforts to teach our rabbinic colleagues about the core theological doctrines of the Christian tradition. It seemed like a logical place to begin. But a detailed analysis of the Trinity only convinced the rabbis that Christians were incompetent at elementary math. From their perspective, we Christians are numerically challenged because we cannot distinguish 3 from 1. They were neither impressed or interested in our metaphysical gymnastics. It was only when we began to shift our collective attention to the sacred stories of our traditions that we found our stride. We became engaged and committed only when we plunged into the narratives that have shaped our sense of who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. We usually began with a biblical story that we shared, stories from the Hebrew Scriptures, and then we traced the distinctive ways that Jews and Christians have read and interpreted these stories over the centuries. In the process, we learned that we often do not see things the same way. We learned how to have a spirited argument, and we learned that our best teachers are often people with whom we passionately disagree. I do not know about you, but the staid Presbyterian home in which I grew up did not instruct me in the art of creative conflict. We chewed with our lips sealed, and it took years of study with my rabbinic brethren to discover that you can digest meals with surprising gusto when your mouth is full and you are simultaneously making an important point. So in that spirit and with this methodology in mind, I want to explore the question of religious conflict by examining a biblical text that Jews and Christians share, a story that is also, interestingly enough, embedded in the Quran, the story of Cain and Abel. Now, in your text that was distributed, we have a translation that is from the New Revised Standard Version. But I wanted to share with you the latest, or what I think is a really fabulous translation of the Hebrew Scriptures by Robert Alter, which was just recently published. Here it goes. The human knew Eve, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have got a man with the Lord. And she bore as well his brother Abel. And Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from the firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offerings, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you incensed? And why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well or whether you do not, at the 10th flap sin crouches, and for you is its longing, but you will rule over it. Whoops. And Cain said to Abel his brother, let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him. The Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And so cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. And if you till the soil, it will no longer give you its strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Now that you have driven me this day from the soil, and I must hide from your presence, I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, therefore whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain so that whoever found him would not slay him. Now, if we had time, we would conduct a Beit Midrash, and we would break into small groups, and you would interrogate this text, the story of the first murder, and challenge each other's interpretations. And if we did this right, we would fill the room with a raucous sound of rambunctious debate. But given the time constraints, let's see if we can crack open this narrative together. And what strikes you about this biblical narrative? Is there anything disturbing or troubling or surprising here? Yeah.
Why did the Lord not acknowledge Cain's offering?
Yeah, this is enormously puzzling. Why is there regard for Abel on God's part, but none for Cain? We want to return to this. Very important question. Other things stand out. Make a raucous noise, ladies and gentlemen.
So,
Yes, please.
The Lord's protection for Cain at the end, I think, is so striking.
Yeah,
Even though he is killed, the Lord will not let him be killed.
yeah, that's right. There is this protection that is distributed. This becomes an enormously important point in subsequent traditions of interpretation. Thank you, Maria. Now, other things stand out. Please, Bob.
did the Lord really instruct Cain on what his desires were?
Yeah. I mean, this raises an interesting question. What kind of teacher was the Lord? And for that matter, what kind of parent was the Lord? I mean, I know that if I take my two sons out for ice cream, and I give one an ice cream cone and the other I don't have any regard for, all hell breaks loose in the family. So the question of God's parenting skills comes into play. Other comments or questions?
Yes,
Yeah.
the mark of Cain, I always thought that that was, if one bore the mark of Cain, one was similarly cursed.
Yeah, so the mark of Cain is double-edged. On the one hand, it reveals a curse or a punishment. On the other hand, it is a protective signal. Anything else? Yes, please.
Cain's first reaction, instead of trying to figure out what's going on, is to kill his brother, as if that's going to solve whatever problem he has.
Yeah. The text is, of course, filled with these intriguing gaps. And there is a gap between the point where the Lord speaks and is warning Cain to get a grip. And then you jump to they're going out to the field together. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, what might have transpired in between? And was it an instantaneous response on Cain's part? That sort of the text invites that level of musing, of reflection. Please.
There's another thing, which is there's no capital punishment for this crime.
Yes.
Capital punishment is forbidden here.
Well, it doesn't occur here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other comments?
Cain doesn't show any remorse. He is feeling sorry for himself because his punishment is too great.
Yeah. I want to come back to this point. What do we make of Cain's response? There's a great ambiguity which we'll try to tease out in a minute. Mike, and then over here.
Well, and related to that, Cain doesn't get angry with God. Cain kills his brother.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you make of
misplaced? It seems like God's the one who was being unfair.
Yeah. Now there's a whole tradition, again, which is kind of covered over, but it's lifted up in the rabbinic tradition, of Cain actually speaking back and arguing with God. It's like, what do you set me up here. And then, by the way, that same dynamic figures into Thomas Mann's 2-volume work, Joseph and his brothers, again, a kind of argument with the divine that is embedded in that literary text. Yes?
I have sort of a problem with reality here. I mean, we have God talking to people. What's the intercourse there that's happening?
Yeah, you mean that doesn't happen when you get up in the morning? Yeah, no, there is definitely within the book of Genesis this wonderful sense that the line between human and divine is porous. There is an interplay or flow back and forth, which is very much played out. And some folks argue that as you trace the Hebrew Scriptures, in a sense you see God receding more and more into the horizon. Other comments?
It was the same thing you just said. I mean, when you talk to God, how does that work? And is it a voice? Is he there? Or is that all in his conscious that he's going through all that? Or?
Yeah. Well, again, there are all sorts of psychological musings about that. Nowadays, if somebody comes and says they've been having conversations with God, we're ready to check them into the psychiatric ward. Not so much in the biblical narrative. Well, let's circle back to the text for a little bit, because I want to walk you through a few things that I think are noteworthy. First of all, it's worth paying attention to the names of the son. Eve's naming of his first child plays off the Hebrew word kana, which means to get, to acquire, to make. And there is considerable fanfare around this because he is the result of a partnership with the divine. Now again, I don't know how it was for you, but when our first child was born, we thought the Messiah had a line. And it was only a couple of months of colic that disabused us of that notion. So there's a big fuss, there's a big deal made about Cain. Not so much with the second son, Abel, Havel, which in Hebrew means a vapor, a puff of air, a breath that vanishes. Cain is firmly established, he's grounded, while Abel barely exists. He is the first invisible man. There is a problematic asymmetry from the start, an uneven distribution of parental attention, and it's evident from the very get-go. Second, the text does not really provide an explanation why God accepts Abel's offering while disregarding Cain's. This presents a major challenge. God appears to play favorites for no apparent reason. There is ostensibly something arbitrary, even unjust in Abel's election. The divine favoritism has haunted Jews and Christians for centuries, and there are countless efforts made to suggest that Cain's sacrifice was superior to Abel's sacrifice was superior to Cain's, and that Abel's character was noble while Cain was somehow flawed. There's a very interesting midrash, which goes like this, that Eve had a dream. And in this dream, she envisions that her sons kill each other. So she tells Adam the next morning about this very disturbing, haunting dream. And so Adam and Eve put their heads together and they say, I know what we'll do. We'll make sure they don't go into the same line of work. One of them will make a farmer and one will be a herder. So, as most parents know, the best laid plans don't always pan out. But the trouble is this. If you simply go with the text itself, the conundrum is extremely difficult to explain away. 3, some scholars argue that this preferential treatment sheds light on the origins of religious conflict. The assumption being that God does not have enough love to go around. In this story, the belief that there is only one God, monotheism, plays into a deadly logic and seems to generate a culture of scarcity. In order for one brother to win, the other must lose. The accusation is that biblical monotheism operates with a zero-sum logic. And here the pattern is instituted, only to be played out over and over again. One son is chosen, the other is overlooked, neglected, judged by what he lacks, and in the end, condemned to wander, an outsider, a pariah, an outcast. So it's no wonder that Jews, Christians, and Muslims have all, each in their own way, struggled to establish themselves as the elect, the chosen, the blessed, while the other religious siblings are rendered irrelevant at best, worse, rejected and condemned, or worse still, consigned to the inner circle of hell among the despised and doomed. According to this line of interpretation, the problem of religious violence has its origins in the monotheistic deity enshrined first within the Bible and then the Quran. The jealous Lord who aims to put every other god out of business sets in motion a sibling rivalry that inexorably turns ugly and brutal. The best way to take possession of God's blessing? Eliminate the competition. As we'll see in greater detail, buried in this narrative are some of the incendiary elements that go into the making of holy wars. But before highlighting these hazardous dynamics, I cannot resist pointing out a few more aspects of this remarkable story. One, after the murder and Cain's effort to deflect attention away from the crime, God demands that Cain stop and listen. And what he hears is the sound of Abel's blood crying out. Actually, the Hebrew word is damim, which is in the plural. His bloods cry out. The rabbinic sages indicate that it was not just Abel who was killed, but all those to whom he might have given life. And therefore, anyone who saves a life, it is as though he saved an entire world. By the way, this, and also, by the way, the corollary to that is anyone who takes the life, it's as though he destroyed an entire world. By the way, the same adage is picked up and given prominence within the Quran. If you look at Surah 532, you'll see it. And it's at the conclusion of its version of the Cain and Abel story. Second thing, notice that the crimes and misdemeanors of humanity spill into and are absorbed by the earth, Adamah. This dynamic can be found in many biblical passages, starting with the story of Adam and Eve. The earth pays a dreadful price for the abuse that we visit on one another. As a consequence of our treatment of one another, the land is cursed, and we become alienated from our vocation to care for the environment and to make it our home. 3, when Cain responds to God's verdict, he asserts that his punishment is too great to bear. Now, the Hebrew word that is translated as punishment is avon, which also means iniquity. So here, there is a delicious ambiguity in Cain's response. On the one hand, Cain comes across as a conniver, as you suggested, a schemer who's struggling to get his sentence reduced. He's, if you will, an artful dodger. On the other hand, Cain may be making a confession. The enormity of what he's done, the sheer magnitude of his crime, living with that weight is more than he can carry. His guilt, his reckoning with his own iniquity is crushing him. And so he turns to God in an act of repentance. Depending on how you translate and interpret this word avon, punishment or iniquity, you get two radically different portraits. Is Cain trying to wiggle out of his punishment? Is he refusing to take responsibility for his deed? Or is Cain not just the first murderer, but also the first penitent? The text leaves open this haunting question. 4. Cain is marked, as many of you have noted. And again, there is a noteworthy ambiguity about this sign. On the one hand, the mark signals Cain out as a criminal. On the other, it also serves as a protective shield. The mark announces his crime, and at the same time is given to prevent an escalation of violence. Now, there are many more conundrums within this narrative, but to get back to our central question, the origins of religious violence, I want to explore how this biblical narrative has lived within our respective tradition. This, again, is a huge subject because Jews, Christians, and Muslims have all been troubled by this story and developed myriad interpretations. I'm going to highlight one interpretive trajectory that originates with the most influential of the church fathers, St. Augustine. His reading of the Cain and Abel story is prominently displayed in his magnus opus, The City of God, but it's also embedded within the work entitled Against Faustus the Manichaean, which was written in 398. Now, just a couple of words to provide some context. The Manichaeans were dualists who regarded the God of creation as an inferior deity enmeshed in the physical world. The Hebrew Bible, they argued, failed to offer the guidance needed to escape entrapment in the material world. From their perspective, the Hebrew Bible was a dead end. It provided no path to attain spiritual perfection. So the Manichaeans concluded that scriptures had distorted and corrupted Jews and Christians. Augustine, who himself had once been entangled in the Manichaean community, battled now to reclaim this scriptural heritage and to reestablish its divine authority. He did so by insisting that the Bible must be affirmed as a single, irreducible whole. To advance his project, Augustine used a method of interpretation that dug beneath the literal and historical layers to unearth a deeper spiritual truth. The tools that he used to get beneath the surface were typologies and allegories. These interpretive strategies enabled him to conclude that there were no problems with the text. The Manichaeans were dead wrong about this. The problems are with the interpreters, not only the Manichaeans, but also the Jews. Neither group knew how to extract the spiritual treasure buried within Holy Scriptures. Now listen to Augustine's treatment of this story. God regards not the sacrifice of Cain, but he regards the sacrifice of Abel. Abel, the younger brother, is killed by the elder brother. Christ, the head of the younger people, is killed by the elder brother of the Jews. Abel dies in the field, Christ dies on Calvary. God asked Cain where his brother is, not as if he didn't know, but as a judge asks a guilty criminal. Cain replies he knows not, and that he is not his brother's keeper. Cain's ignorance was pretended, and the Jews are deceived in their refusal of Christ. So the unbelieving people of the Jews is cursed from the earth, that is, from the church, which in the confession of sins has opened its mouth to receive the blood shed for the remission of sins by the hand of the people that would not be under grace but under rule. That is, the church admits and avows the Jewish people to be cursed because after killing Christ, they continued to till the ground of an earthly circumcision, an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover, while the hidden strength or virtue of making known Christ is not yielded to the Jews while they continue in impiety and unbelief. So in the end of the 7 days of time, the continued preservation of the Jews will be a proof to believing Christians of the subjection merited by those who in the pride of their kingdom put the Lord to death. Now this typological reading of the Cain and Abel story is deeply troubling to us, I hope. But it reflects a very common practice of superimposing a new and alien layer of meaning on top of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Jews are caricatured as blind and carnal. They're condemned because they keep faith with the traditions of their ancestors and uphold the covenantal bond established at Sinai. Like Cain, Jews are condemned for the crime of killing an innocent. And like the dissembling Cain, Jews pretended ignorance of their crime. They refused to take responsibility for their transgression. They failed to understand and respond to the inner truth of their own sacred scriptures. Just as Cain was cursed, so Jews were cursed from the earth. Just as Cain was sentenced to a life of displacement and homelessness, so Jews were condemned to wander the earth. Their degradation served as a negative witness, the price that must be paid by anyone who rejects Christ as their Lord and Savior. Jews were marked as a people whose abasement proved the crimes of the Jews still echo through the ages and reverberate around the world. Now, it would be a dreadful mistake to draw a line from Augustine's writings to the Nazi death camps. Yet Augustine's interpretation, along with the teachings of many other church fathers, provided a biblical and theological warrant for the marginalization of the Jewish people. Interpretations of sacred texts, such as Genesis 4, sanctified subsequent legal and cultural policies in the centuries to come. An image took hold to justify prohibitions against Jews who were denied the opportunity to own land, to attend universities, to pursue positions of public leadership and responsibility. Now, books like this can live many lives, and oftentimes they are picked up by subsequent generations and sometimes given an insidious spin. The writings of many of the church's most distinguished scholars and saints were weaponized in later centuries. And the really shocking fact is that the legislation etched into the Nazi Nuremberg laws are not nearly as original as most of us imagined and would have hoped. But this too needs to be noted. Scholars such as Dr. Mark Saperstein have noted that Augustine established a protective membrane around the Jewish community. Just as Cain was protected from those who might pursue a path of lethal retaliation, Augustine insisted that the Jews also serve an indispensable function in God's economy of salvation, dispersed among the nations and serving as custodians of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Jews provided a universal witness, and they must not be killed. There is much, much more that could be said about Augustine and the ways in which he used the Jews as a foil to attack the Manichaeans. And as a quick aside, it's worth noting that whenever Christians get confused about their own identity and break into sectarian groups, more often than not, the battle to establish identity, the Jews are put in the crossfire. But for our purposes, this use of the Cain and Abel story enables us to get a better handle on features of religious conflict that easily spin out of control. So let me sum up. Religious conflict becomes noxious when one group establishes exclusive claims to ultimate truth. When that group uses sacred texts to demean and then demonize any and everyone who disagrees with them. And then when these attitudes are translated into policies that render opponents as enemies, whose very humanity in the end is denied. So we need to be vigilant about the ways in which ancient polemics are recapitulated in our own time. We need to be on guard when certain evangelicals define the United States as a Christian nation, when non-Christians are framed as outsiders, foreigners, interlopers whose status at best is second class. We need to wake up and speak out when certain politicians use religion to assail Jews, Muslims, atheists, the other. We need to stand up when religion is used to confine blacks, women, homosexuals, relegating them to the back of the bus. We can see the pattern etched into the daily news. Religion continues to be deployed against the most vulnerable among us. There is a long and anguished history of these kinds of abuses. So what are we to do about it? What are we to do about it? The Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges once noted that to die for a religion is easier than to live it absolutely. His musings on Cain and Abel's story also have bearing on our challenge. He envisioned a postscript, a follow-up encounter in another dimension. It goes like this. Abel and Cain met again after Abel's death. They were walking in the desert and knew each other from a distance, for both men were very tall. The brothers sat on the ground, made a fire, and ate, and for a while they were untalkative, the way tired men can be after a long day's work. In the sky, some still, unnamed star appeared. By the firelight, Cain made out the mark of the stone on Abel's forehead. He dropped the food he was about to put into his mouth and asked to be forgiven for his crime. I no longer remember. Did you kill me, or was it I who killed you? Abel answered. Here we are together again, just as we used to be. Now I know for sure you've forgiven me, said Cain, because to forget is to have forgiven. I'll try my best to forget too. Yes, said Abel, speaking slowly, you're right. As long as there's remorse, there's guilt. Perhaps it is that the problem in many parts of the world is that too many people have become frozen in versions of the past, locked into collective memories that sustain grievances, resentments, rage, remorse, and guilt. Perhaps humankind would do better if it became more disciplined in the art of forgetfulness. As we grow older and more forgetful, I suppose that you and I will have the opportunity to develop the virtues of amnesia. But in the meantime, I want to offer one other avenue for the imagination to travel. Once again, let's take another look at Cain. God's elevation of Abel and God's disregard of Cain remains mysterious. And throughout the Bible, we struggle to make sense of why God chooses some and not others. Why doesn't God treat us all the same? Is the root of religious violence to be found within monotheism, the allegiance to one and only one God? I don't think so. Here's what strikes me. In this story, God overturns and reverses the favoritism of the parents. Abel, who lived in the shadow of his brother as nothing more than a vapor, is given substance by God's recognition. God rescues him from the condition of invisibility, from the condition of utter anonymity, and thereby suggests that everyone counts. God's blessings often come to rest on those we are most inclined to overlook. So understood, the story is an exhortation not to retrace the path of Cain, but to respond to economic, political, and theological scarcity in very different terms. Creation, as we all know, is lopsided, and God's gifts are unevenly carved up and distributed. Some are endowed with musical talent, others not so much. Some are athletic, others can't chew gum and skip rope. And yet all of us are gifted with experiences and stories uniquely our own. Each and every one of us has something to offer the world that no one else can replicate. We find ourselves in a world in which we must depend on others to help us see farther and to do more than we could possibly do if we were left to our own devices. Our challenge is to come to grips with our limitations and to realize that the one who sees things differently, the one with whom we may most passionately disagree, this one is also divinely chosen and can serve as our best teacher. Imagine if Cain had turned to Abel with a question instead of a rock. Imagine a Cain who seeks insight and understanding from his brother rather than privilege and domination. If only Cain can hold in check his omnivorous appetite for attention and possession and allow himself to be coached and mentored by the one he regards as his competitor and opponent. This trajectory points to a very different theological dynamic. God did not spurn Cain, but required him to receive God's blessing in solidarity with his brother. As one of my colleagues, Kendall Sulin, has argued, each of us, Jews, Christians, Muslims, others, are given different tasks in a single economy of mutual blessing. Sin assaults the link that joins blessing and others. Sin seeks blessing apart from its source in the divine other and apart from the life with the human other. To be sure, the conflicts within and between our religious communities will not disappear any more than the tensions and frictions within ourselves, our families, and our nation are going to disappear anytime soon. Show me someone who no longer feels the push and pull of conflicting claims, the wrangling and discord of interpersonal struggle, and I'll show you someone who most likely woke up dead. Our challenge isn't to dissolve every trace of conflict, but to resist the downward spiral of Cain and develop habits of mind and heart that transform the curses of unresolved conflict into mutual blessing, building an economy of compassionate reciprocity. How we respond to this challenge will, in large measure, determine the kind of world we inhabit and the kind of world that we pass along to our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.